Excellencies, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the United Nations Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, it is my privilege to welcome you today to this commemorative panel discussion entitled 1948-2024, the ongoing Palestinian Nakba, convened under the auspices of our committee. Please allow me to mention, before we begin, that as reminded by the UN Department of Safety and Security, and according to the rules of the Secretariat, no form of protest will be allowed during this meeting. The committee established by the General Assembly in 1975 has an annual program of work to promote the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination, independence, and to establish their own state in accordance with international law and UN resolutions. As such, we advocate with member states and international organizations. We have regularly a series of publications, and we have capacity building program for staff of the Palestinian government. We also organize delegation visits and international meetings in various regions to promote constructive discussions on the question of Palestine and mobilize support for and assistance to the Palestinian people. By holding a commemoration of the Nakba, we intend to continue highlighting this historical moment, marking the plight of the Palestinian people, following the events we organized in 2023 to mark the Nakba's 75th anniversary, as mandated by the General Assembly in Resolution A/Res/77/23 of 30 November 2022. Today's event will consist of a short opening followed by a panel discussion. I will now deliver remarks in my capacity as chair of the Committee for the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. Excellencies, colleagues, dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, last year our committee hosted the first ever UN commemoration of the Nakba to observe its 75th anniversary. Today, we again commemorate the events of 1948 and subsequent years, which led to the dispossession and displacement of approximately 750,000 Palestinians from their ancestral lands. 1 year has passed, and after the atrocities committed by Hamas and other militant groups on the 7th of October, the Israeli response continues to be disproportionate and indiscriminate. Breaches of norms by one group do not excuse breaches of international law and norms by another. What we have witnessed over the past 7 months, much of it broadcast live across the globe, and even by the victims themselves, is unparalleled in recent history. With Gaza being under constant attack and bombardment by Israeli forces, almost 40,000 Palestinians have been killed 75th anniversary as mandated by the General Assembly in Resolution A/Res/77/23 of 30 November 2022. Today's event will consist of a short opening followed by a panel discussion. I will now deliver remarks. 1,000 injured, the vast majority of whom women and children. That is, 1 in of the Palestinian people. To observe its 75th anniversary. Today, we again commemorate the events of 1948 and subsequent years, which led to the dispossession and displacement of approximately 750,000 Palestinians from their ancestral lands. 1 year has passed, and after the atrocities committed by Hamas and other militant groups on the 7th of October, the Israeli response continues to be disproportionate and indiscriminate. Breaches of norms by one group do not excuse breaches of international law and norms by another. What we have witnessed over the past 7 months, much of it broadcast live across the globe, and even by the victims themselves, is unparalleled in recent history. With Gaza being under constant attack and bombardment by Israeli forces, almost 40,000 Palestinians have been killed and almost 80,000 injured, the vast majority of whom women and children. That is, 1 in every 25 Gazans killed. 1 in every 25 Gazans killed. 70% of all buildings have been destroyed. Schools and universities are in rubble. Hospitals are not functioning. And in parallel, while the war on Gaza rages, Israeli attacks by its security forces and armed illegal settlers protected by them. Those attacks on Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem have increased. Palestinian land and buildings are expropriated. Palestinians are beaten and killed with impunity. The number of Palestinian detainees, often held without charge for extended periods of time, is increasing. This is the situation today. The Nakba of 1948 and today's Nakba in Gaza are not two separate, distinct events. Today's Nakba is a repetition of the Nakba of 1948. And all this time, in between, we witnessed Israel's occupation and dispossession of Palestinian property, denial of rights, arbitrary arrests, including of children, brutal and disproportionate use of force, Judaization of East Jerusalem and its cultural symbols, eviction and displacement of its inhabitants. The Nakba, thus, is an ongoing process which has affected the Palestinian people over generations. International norms are flouted, and the perpetrator is seemingly immune from being held accountable. Palestinians are starving and under threat of famine. Humanitarian aid is not delivered in the amounts necessary. Humanitarians, including UN staff and journalists, are killed and injured with impunity, often despite previous coordination and promises of so-called safe routes. This is a dark time for international justice, for accountability under international law, for the rules-based international order that this organization was founded to uphold. Conflict is spreading in the Middle East. The Security Council appears paralyzed, and member states divided. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in this situation we ask ourselves, what can be done? The various actors and concerned parties, citizens of the states, civil society organizations and NGOs, governments and international organizations, all play their part working together. And we have seen throughout the world how civil societies, civil servants, academics, students clamor for an end to this conflict, the return of all hostages, the return of historical justice, freedom, and protection for the Palestinian people. Within the United Nations, our committee plays a key role. We continued advocacy here in New York, in the General Assembly and the Security Council, through events like the one we are holding today, through the committee advocacy via our website and social media, our publications, the development of capacities of the Palestinian government, our international conferences, the panels and delegation visits we organize. Just a few weeks ago, a committee delegation comprising of myself and Minister Mansour visited Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, and also it included also the ambassador of Cuba. We visited Tobago, Guyana, Trinidad, and Tobago, Guyana in the headquarters of CARICOM, the Caribbean community. In the context of that visit, 4 countries have officially recognized the state of Palestine: Barbados and Jamaica in April, Trinidad and Tobago and the Bahamas in May. Thus, by now, all CARICOM members and almost the whole Caribbean has done so. And we hope that this recent wave of support will carry toward the rest of the region and beyond. A key aspect of the efforts towards ending the war on Gaza, ending the occupation, ending the Palestinians' suffering, is the work in our sphere, that of international law and relations, on ensuring that the rules we set for ourselves, the nations of the world, that those rules apply to everyone, that nobody is above the law, and that grave breaches of international law and norms must have consequences. In short, that the weak should be protected from the attacks of the strong. In this, the vast majority of member states, and indeed peoples of the world, stand together. We also call upon the international community, member states and society alike, to redouble our efforts to end the occupation. And this ongoing Nakba and bring to reality the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, including to self-determination and independence, and a just resolution to the plight of Palestinian refugees. Our committee will continue to work towards the day that the Palestinian people will enjoy all-day inalienable rights, and live in a state of their own in peace and prosperity based on the two-state solution that we all know so well, that has for too long eluded implementation. We are determined to continue to stand with the Palestinian people so that one day the Nakba will end. And we call upon all others, member states, organizations, civil society, to do the same. I thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, I would like to now request the representative of the State of Palestine and permanent observer to the United Nations in New York, Minister Riyad Mansour, to deliver his remarks. have the floor.
Mr. Chair, my dear brother, Sheikh Niang, actually my twin brother, Sheikh Niang, dear panelists, dear colleagues and friends, the Nakba encompasses both a personal tragedy for every Palestinian family and a collective ordeal, a historic injustice endured by an entire nation, a majority of which was uprooted overnight from its ancestral land, while the rest were treated as strangers. In their own country. It is an enterprise of displacement and replacement of a people that continue the Nakba. But the Nakba is not a historical event. It is a terrible reality still endured by our people. As Israel has yet to abandon its plans to push us out of history and geography. And this commemoration today comes at a time where one of the most terrible chapters of this ongoing Nakba is underway. Our people in Gaza are besieged, bombed, and starved with one aim: their destruction or their removal. The Israeli government no longer hides its true intentions. The Palestinians have three options: displacement, subjugation, or death, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, or genocide. The denial of our existence as a people continues. The denial of our rights continues. The denial of our statehood continues. But at least Israel, unchecked and unhinged, has confessed to the Nakba it had denied so far. Its extremist leaders say it unequivocally. They want a second Nakba, thus confessing to the first. A second Nakba that allows them to get rid of the Palestinian people once and for all, finish the job started decades ago. But the Palestinian people are here to stay. Their resurrection after 1948 should convince anyone that our nation will never die. But that is not a reason to allow our people to be killed once more. There is now universal recognition of the Palestinian people, and soon it will be matched by universal recognition of our state. There is a global consensus on the imperative of ending Israeli occupation, fulfillment of our national and human rights, including to the independence of our state, and having two democratic states, Palestine and Israel, live side by side in peace and security on the 1967 borders. These should not be mere wishes expressed in resolutions and obliterated by Israel on the ground in full impunity. These should be commands, the violations of which should trigger the strongest response. It is time for accountability and justice, so freedom can prevail and peace can be achieved. The Nakba must end, and stopping the Israeli assault against our people is the indispensable first step on that course, including regarding Rafah. Gaza is composed mostly of refugees who endured the Nakba, and instead of witnessing its end, they have to live through it once again, or succumb to it this time around. Enough pain, enough suffering. Not a single Palestinian generation was spared, not one. It is time to end the carnage, to end the occupation. And to end the exodus and save generations to come from death, servitude, and forced displacement. Together, all of us, including the brave students from universities across the United States and in all corners of the globe. And I mention again the brave spark that started at Columbia University. Which we salute them for their bravery and for principled position, calling for the end of the war and the arming of the Israeli army. To gather all of us with the solidarity of peoples and nations around the world, we can finally start to correct one of the greatest injustices of our time. Palestine has become a symbol for all freedom-loving and peace-loving nations. I repeat, Palestine has become a symbol for all freedom-loving and peace-loving nations. Palestine's destiny was, is, and will always be freedom. It should not be delayed any longer. End the injustice and free Palestine. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Mansour. I think the words we have just heard convey the conviction of a people who is a victim of tyranny, but has remained determined to keep the hope of prevailing justice alive in the face of oppression. We admire your resilience. We admire the resilience of the Palestinian people. That is why you continue to inspire the international community, to inspire the community. With the conviction that in the end, justice will prevail, will triumph over injustice, as history has always shown. Thank you, Minister Mansour, for your inspiring statement. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like now to request Mrs. Zaina Azam, whom I welcome. Mrs. Zaina Azam, who is a Palestinian-American writer, poet, editor. And community activist, whose work addresses themes including war and displacement, refugee and immigrant experiences. I invite her to take the floor, and today we have the privilege really to hear her reading some of her poetry. Mrs. Azam, you have the floor.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and thank you to the committee for the exercise of the inalienable right of the Palestinian people, for inviting me to participate in this solemn and meaningful program. It's my honor to commemorate with poetry the 76th year of the Nakba, the Palestinians' forced displacement from their home. As I watch the ongoing genocide in Gaza, I have a greater understanding of the trauma my parents suffered as refugees from Palestine. I'm honored to pay tribute to all the Palestinian martyrs, the wounded, starving, imprisoned, and abused, whether living in occupied Palestine, refugee camps, tents, or in the diaspora. My parents were originally from Nazareth, and my mother grew up in Jaffa. After they married, they were living in Haifa in 1948. They and my oldest brother and my entire extended family were forced to flee during the war. My parents' names are Samih and Elise Azzam. My poems and my activism for Palestine are all dedicated to their memory. The first poem I'd like to read today is about my father. I thought I'd mention that he worked for many years for UNRWA in the Beirut office when I was a child. This is a poem I wrote after he died. It's titled, "My Father is Now a Memory." My father is now a memory, dreamlike, clinging, fleeting, rooted. I will nurture it as he nurtured his plants, babies in a cradle, rocking gently. The roses in his garden mourn. He loved us, we loved him. The figs stand still, wishing for his tenderness. My father searched for Palestine in them, the memory of sweetness reawakened, nostalgia guiding him homeward. I can't remember him as a younger man anymore. He's an old man with clouds for hair, crevices in the earth of his face, a waterfall nose, crescent moon smile. He would sing snippets of a song, recite a line of poetry. Sometimes it would make sense. Sometimes it was out of place. He might laugh heartily, amused by a memory. He tried to teach my children to lick a drop of coffee from his little finger, as he had done with me on his lap decades ago. He clung to memories, found solace in reliving, replicating. Maybe he could find a home for the old in the new. My father yearned for the homeland he saw again only once in 50 years. We should never have left, he would say, out of the blue, shaking his head. They shot your neighbor. It was wartime. The Deir Yassin massacre had just come to light. No matter. We should have stayed. Maybe he would have been killed too. Maybe I would never have been born. A fig tree cut down. A fig imagined. 15 roses he bought the day before he died, planted only 3. My mother gave the others away to friends one by one. They will yearn for him, be planted far from home, refugees in diaspora. He loved us. We loved him. Since October 2023, Israel's war on Gaza has been a war on Gaza's children. Palestine Red Crescent Society just reported that over 15,000 children in Gaza have been killed. An entire generation has been annihilated or physically and mentally scarred forever. I wrote a poem at the end of October 2023 when I learned that some parents in Gaza were writing their children's names on their legs so they could be identified should the parents or the children be killed. I recently saw a video of a little boy in Gaza who was writing his own name on his leg, quote, "so I can be identified," unquote. He cried. It was truly heartbreaking. As a parent and as a grandparent, I am so heartbroken. The poem is titled Write My Name, and it's in the voice of a child from Gaza. Write my name on my leg, Mama. Use the black permanent marker with the ink that doesn't bleed if it gets wet, the one that doesn't melt if it's exposed to heat. Write my name on my leg, Mama. Make the lines thick and clear, and add your special flourishes so I can take comfort in seeing my mama's handwriting when I go to sleep. Write my name on my leg, Mama, on the legs of my sisters and brothers. This way we will belong together. This way we will be known as your children. Write my name on my leg, Mama. And please write your name and Baba's name on your legs too, so we will be remembered as a family. Write my name on my leg, Mama. Don't add any numbers, like when I was born or the address of our home. I don't want the world to list me as a number. I have a name, and I'm not a number. Write my name on my leg, Mama. When the bomb hits our house, when the walls crush our skulls and bones, our legs will tell our story, how there was nowhere for us to run. One day, it struck me how central the concept of khair, or goodness, is to Arab culture. The Arabic word khair is uttered often during each day. How lovely it is that one of our major touchstones of our lives is the idea of goodness, and we use it in our speech and with each other all the time. Here's a poem titled Khair. From the time farmers rise with the sun until night descends, there is talk of it. Songs and Quranic verses about khair, morning of khair, evening of khair. There is no getting around goodness. Tusbahi ala khair, my mother would wish me as she kissed my forehead at bedtime. May you wake up to goodness. Later I learned to respond, wa inti min ahlo. May you be part of its family, the family of khair. Even watching TV, as we waited for bad news from Gaza, she would admonish, khair inshallah, goodness, God willing. No matter the misfortune, she was sure Allah would eventually bring khair to Palestine. Maybe it all started with her neighbors in Jaffa, the family whose name was Khair Allah, God's goodness. From kindness to comity, their ancestors packed so much in this name. It was a hedge against hardship, an incantation in their bones, Palestine's bones, where khair resides from morning till night, in a mother's kiss at bedtime, deep in a farmer's land. There, the roots of khair multiply in the earth, goodness bristling. Before I read my last poem today, I'd like to leave you with a thought. Palestine's beloved national poet, Mahmoud Darwish, once said that, quote, every beautiful poem is an act of resistance, unquote. So here's my final poem. It's titled Colors for the Diaspora. It was originally inspired by the colors of the Palestinian flag, how it's been illegal for Palestinians to display these colors. Although I do mention the 4 banned colors in this poem, I include other colors as well. In this way, the black, green, red, and white are found organically with other colors in nature in Palestine. The poem can be read as an elegy to our forefathers and foremothers who were displaced and dispossessed of their national home, searching for the colors of their land, and struggling for the liberation of Palestine. Colors for the diaspora. Blue-green, watery globe, tugging to a red core. We are a distant comet, white cloud of unburnished rocks, frisking the heavens for an arc to earth, sea, home. Green-brown Palestine, cactus fruit and wild thyme, olive orchards, cypress trees. We travel on your mountaintops, tethered by voices from suitcases and the yaw of blackened keys. Blue-black night, silver stars of ancestors traveling a displaced orbit around a lost sun, repeating, when will we see the colors of our land? When will we land? Thank you.
Mrs. Azam, I cannot thank you enough, not only for honoring us with your presence here, but also for sharing through your very beautiful poems such moving, captivating, and emotional testimony of the Palestinian resilience. Thank you so very much. This concludes the opening session of our panel discussion. But before moving to the next segment, I would like to really thank here our colleagues, because we have seen so many peers attending this important event. And also we have seen also the highest representative of organizations such as the OIC and the Arab League being here. So to all of you, I would like to express the gratitude of the committee for your involvement and for your support. I will now go to the next segment by giving the floor to each of our panelists for short briefings on the respective topics and areas. After the interventions, I will open the floor for questions, starting with committee members and observers, and then to others. In the interest of time and to allow for rich discussion, I will invite those representatives of member and observer states and intergovernmental organizations who prepared statements to send these documents to the Division for Palestinian Rights of the United Nations Secretariat, and these statements will be posted on the committee website. Please be reminded that simultaneous interpretation is provided in 6 languages: Arabic, Chinese, English, French, Russian, and Spanish, to accommodate all interventions of our panelists as well as our diverse esteemed audience. This event is webcast live on the UN Web TV site on all languages. I also want to inform that to reduce the usage of paper, documents related to this panel discussions and the committee have been put in a virtual folder, and you can access it by scanning the QR code near the entrances into your smartphones. All participants are also encouraged to disseminate information about the panel discussion on their social media and use the hashtag #RightsForPalestine. Let's start with our first panelist, Mr. Adi Msiis, whom I'm pleased to see again, who is an assistant professor and academic director at Queen's University, Ottawa. His main focus is on the intersection of power, politics, law, and justice, and the practical impact of those phenomena on international relations in general and on unprecedented peoples in particular. Mr. Msiis joined the Queen's Faculty of Law in 2018, following a 12-year career as a UN official in the Middle East, first with UNRWA and then with UNHCR. Mr. Msiis, you have the floor.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I should like to begin by thanking the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People for convening this event and also its Division for Palestinian Rights. It is a pleasure to be with you once again. It is exceedingly difficult to speak about the Nakba in a manner that sufficiently captures the enormity of the Palestinian predicament, a long festering wound upon the conscience of these United Nations. Ethnically cleansed, denationalized, dispossessed, occupied, racially discriminated against, and now the target of what the International Court of Justice has determined is a risk of irreparable harm to their right to be protected from genocide. It is as though the Palestinian people have been made to endure an endless Calvary, as Edward Said once put it, incessant, unremitting, unforgiving. As we gather to mark 76 years of Nakba, under the long shadow of Gaza, the theme of continuity is ever present. What the Palestinian people has been enduring for 3/4 of a century, uniquely on full display in real time on social media feeds as we speak, is a singular experience of unmitigated disaster, of the sustained and concerted effort to do away with their collective and national existence in their native land. The Nakba continues because it is the logical culmination of Zionist settler colonialism in Palestine, which has yet to complete its task, with its insatiable desire to displace and replace Palestine's natives, as foretold and proclaimed openly by its founding fathers, institutions, and present-day adherents. As Patrick Wolf has noted, settler colonialism involves, quote, a logic of elimination. This logic strives for the dissolution of native societies while it erects new colonial societies in their place. In this sense, settler colonizers come to stay, with invasion and colonizing constituting, in Wolf's words, a structure, not an event. Your Excellencies, the Nakba is a structure, not an event. This structure is in overdrive as we speak, with a pace and fervor never before seen. It is happening publicly, its authors openly admit its aims, and yet little to nothing is being done to stop it by those in a position to do so. It is being actively colluded in by a small number of Western states and political elites, led by the United States. It has cast doubt, serious doubt, over the continued viability of the post-World War II international legal order. These Western states have fashioned all manner of Orwellian justifications for their collusion with the Nakba in Gaza, whether nonsensical arguments about Israel's so-called right of self-defense, dismissed by the International Court of Justice 20 years ago, or Israel's purported purity of arms, belied by countless TikTok videos of sadistic IDF soldiers on the ground, or acquiescence in spurious Israeli allegations or claims that UNRWA, the life-giving, life-saving humanitarian arm of the United Nations in Gaza, was somehow involved in 7 October, now debunked by a high-level independent review panel, if any was ever needed. The vocious of these Western justifications is rooted in one simple truth that runs like a thread throughout: the consistent denial of the very humanity, agency, and political rights of the Palestinian people, a people for whom the United Nations has a permanent responsibility until their plight is resolved in accordance with international law. The UN's permanent responsibility for the question of Palestine is often spoken of in these hallowed halls, but what is not spoken of as often or at all are the reasons as to why this responsibility actually exists. And for that, it is essential to discuss the fateful decision made by the then Western-dominated United Nations General Assembly to recommend partition of Palestine against the will of the country's indigenous population, the majority population, through Resolution 181 of 29 November 1947. A review of the terms of the partition plan and the accompanying UN record, recounted in my recently published book on the United Nations and the question of Palestine, reveals that the plan was illegal under prevailing international law. This illegality helped lay the groundwork for the Nakba of 1948 and its painfully unjust results that have continued and indeed accelerated ever since remain with us. Your Excellencies, as many of you know, Resolution 181 provided for the partition of Palestine into an Arab state and a Jewish state in economic union, with the city of Jerusalem and its environs established as a corpus separatum. Both states were required to adopt democratic constitutions, establish government on the basis of universal suffrage, and guarantee to all persons equality before the law. Sounds good, doesn't it? But by any objective assessment, the terms of the partition plan revealed an absolute contempt for the principle of self-determination of peoples as applied to Palestine as a Class A mandated territory, rooted upon the idea, which you will all recognize, of majority democratic rule. Territorially, the plan allotted the Jewish state 57% of Palestine, including its most fertile land, despite the Jewish settler population comprising only 1/3 of the country and possessing only 5.6% of registered land ownership. Demographically, although the proposed Arab state would include a clear majority of approximately 725,000 Arabs to 10,000 Jews, the proposed Jewish state would contain a total population of 1,080,000, consisting of 509,000 Arabs to 499,000 Jews. And this meant that based on the United Nations record, minority rule would prevail in the purported Jewish state from the outset. This, despite the terms of Resolution 181 requiring that the proposed Jewish state be democratic, ensure universal suffrage, and guarantee equality before the law. The UN partition plan was a glaring anomaly under prevailing international law. As I outline in my book, only 2 courses of action were legally open to the Assembly at the time. First, immediate independence of the whole of Palestine, in line, oh shock and horror of it, with the wishes of the majority of its inhabitants. Or 2, second, UN trusteeship. Put simply, if the new UN charter system was to prevail, partition could never be legal without the freely expressed consent of the governed. The UN record demonstrates that partition was not based on these international legal considerations. Rather, it was driven by hegemonic European states and their settler colonial affiliates for political reasons. The UN record shows that the declared goal of these states was to rectify Europe's centuries-old Jewish question in the wake of the Holocaust, and to do so at the expense of the innocent third-party Palestinians. As noted by the permanent representative of Yemen at the time, quote, "If Jews were persecuted in Europe, what have the people of Palestine to do with that?" End quote. The UN record demonstrates that partition was accompanied by a complete contempt for principles of self-determination and democratic governance as applied to Palestine as a Class A mandated territory. For instance, in its majority report recommending partition to the Assembly, the UN Special Committee on Palestine, UNSCOP, expressly noted, and I quote, "With regard to the principle of self-determination, although international recognition was extended to this principle at the end of the First World War, and it was adhered to with regard to the other Arab territories at the time of the creation of the A mandates, it was not applied to Palestine, obviously because of the intention to make possible the creation of the Jewish national home there. Actually, it may well be said that the Jewish national home and the sui generis mandate for Palestine run counter to that principle," end quote, run counter to the principle of self-determination. Astoundingly, none of this gave the UNSCOP majority reason for pause. An even more animated rationale in support of partition came from one of UNSCOP's members who unabashedly asserted on the floor of the General Assembly on 10 October 1947, and I quote, "Palestine was no more Arab than certain Spanish countries of Latin America were Indian. The Jews had made a pleasant and healthy country out of a land in which a sparse and rachitic population had merely vegetated. It was incomprehensible that the Arabs should adduce their numerical superiority as an argument. An ignorant majority should not be allowed to impose its will," end quote. An ignorant majority should not be allowed to impose its will, end quote. Your Excellencies, one could go on, but you get the point. For the Western-dominated UN, at the time, of course, the Palestinian people did not matter when it came to the application of international law in 1947. Their claims, let alone their existence, were not taken seriously by the Western powers. Like all colonial peoples, they were treated with racist contempt and as a mere impediment to more noble European interests that were to be pursued, come what may. Why, one might ask, does any of this matter when we speak of the 1948 Nakba and the UN's permanent responsibility for the question of Palestine? Well, the UN record shows that UNSCOP and the Western-dominated General Assembly suffered from a cognitive dissonance as to the inevitability of violence befalling Palestine and its people following the passage of the partition plan. We now know from the UN record that the 1948 Nakba consisted of innumerable acts of widespread, premeditated, and systematic violence aimed at expelling or encouraging the mass flight of the indigenous Palestinian population from the country. These acts included the wholesale and indiscriminate bombardment, siege, and expulsion of the Palestinian population from cities, towns, and villages. At least 31 confirmed massacres of Palestinian civilians, including use of mass graves as means of concealment, rape and other forms of sexual and gender-based violence, psychological terror campaigns broadcasting horrors to befall the population if it did not flee, biological warfare, and a host of scorched earth tactics, including the deliberate destruction of between 392 and 418 Palestinian villages, whence at least half the refugees were expelled. And as the ethnic cleansing was unfolding, and well before the last armistice agreement was signed in 1949, the new state of Israel consolidated its conquest, seizing, looting, and settling Palestine refugees and state property. On the eve of the Zionist offensives in April 1948, David Ben-Gurion, who would become Israel's first prime minister, said, quote, "We shall enter the empty villages and settle in them. In peacetime, we would not have been able to do this," end quote. Accordingly, about 135 new Jewish settlements were established during the 1948 war, most of which on Arab-owned land, including dozens on territory earmarked by the UN partition plan for the Palestinian Arab state. Tens of thousands of new Jewish settlers were moved in by Israel into Palestinian refugee houses that remained intact. They and their descendants remain in that property to this day. It is therefore not without reason that when Israeli leaders now call for the resettlement of the Gaza Strip in the heat of battle, the people of Palestine shudder in fear of what is to come. Your Excellencies, Palestine's initial ethnic cleansing in the 1948 Nakba was consolidated by an Israeli cabinet decision of 16 June of that year to bar return of the Palestinian refugees to their property and their homes. And this was followed by various administrative acts, including the blocking of Palestinian refugee bank accounts and the passage of legislation in Israel aimed at giving the imprimatur of legality to it all. Israel's ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian refugees, its wholesale dispossession and usurpation of their property, its mass denationalization of that population, and its denial of the right of those refugees to return and restitution constitute gross and systematic violations of relevant international law, which continue to the present day. For almost 8 decades, they have been compounded by myriad actions of Israel, administrative, legislative, judicial, and now military, all of which have been animated by what Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem has declared is a regime of Jewish supremacy, their words, not mine, between the river and the sea. An apartheid regime, friends. Literally no facet of Palestinian life has been left untouched. Which brings us to the Nakba of today. Even before 7 October, Gaza had been shorn by Israel of anything remotely capable of sustaining a dignified life for one person, let alone 2.3 million. 56 years of illegal Israeli military occupation, compounded by 16 years of Israeli blockade, multiple Israeli military assaults resulting in tens of thousands of casualties, including the killing and maiming of thousands of children. A multi-decade process of de-development and de-industrialization, resulting in a 45% unemployment rate and a 60% poverty rate, with 80% of the population dependent on some form of international assistance. 97% of drinking water unfit for human consumption, and a healthcare system on its last legs for having been suffocated by the blockade. All of that before 7 October. All this to say, and as noted by the Secretary General on 25 October, the events of 7 October did not happen in a vacuum. Since that fateful day, Israel has deployed a level of violence not seen anywhere this century. Total war has descended upon Gaza. According to the United Nations, approximately 35,000 Palestinians have been killed so far, 2/3 of whom women and children, and another 78,000 are injured, many for life. A further 1.7 million, that's almost 80% of the population of the Gaza Strip, have been forcibly displaced with indiscriminate bombardment, yet again, scorched earth tactics and starvation as a tool of war deployed against them. Humanitarian aid is in frighteningly short supply as objects indispensable for the survival of the civilian population continue to be arbitrarily withheld by the occupying power. Life-saving medicines, anesthetics, food, fuel, water, electricity. According to the International Court of Justice, famine is setting in Gaza, and as mentioned, there is a risk of irreparable harm to Palestinian rights to be protected from genocide. Gaza, a place I once called home, is being ground to dust. No place is safe, no home, no hovel, no refugee camp, no hospital, no school, no UN shelter, not in the north, not in the middle, not in the south, nowhere. I've often wondered what I would have done had I lived during the time of the 1948 Nakba. Would I have acted on my conscience to stop the atrocities unfolding before me, or would I have remained silent as much of the world did? It would appear that fate has now ironically presented us all, dear friends, comrades, with such a moment in Gaza. Israeli leaders are now openly boasting that Gaza is, quote, rolling out the Gaza Nakba. Forgive me, that Israel is now rolling out the Gaza Nakba. Their soldiers are planting flags in Gaza beaches, vowing to reestablish Israeli colonies there. But the world is watching. In the words of one sitting member of the ICJ, quote, the alarm has now been sounded by the court. All the indicators of genocidal activities are flashing red in Gaza. An injunction has been served for ending the atrocities. The provisional measures indicated by the court are binding. They are not something that a state party to the convention is free to respect or to ignore according to its own pleasure. They must be implemented, end quote. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the question is, will they be implemented? It is clear that the answer to this has already been furnished by Israel, and that answer is no. Not when the court issued its first provisional measures order on 26 January, nor when it issued its last one on 28 March. Just as international law was trampled on in the 1948 Nakba, so too is it being trampled on in the 2024 Nakba. The historical record is clear. If change is to happen, it must come from elsewhere. And this means you. This means all of us. If the words never again are to mean anything, if these United Nations are to honor the legacy of those for whom those words were initially fashioned, we must summon the courage to apply them at all times and in all places, without fear or favor. If anything is clear, that time and that place is the Gaza ghetto. That time and that place is now. The people of Palestine demand nothing else and nothing less. Our humanity does, too. Thank you.
Mr. Msais, I would like to thank you for your strong and very pertinent intervention, and yet moving intervention, and for your very important reminder of the responsibility of the international community and of the UN on the question of Palestine. I would appreciate if the committee can have a copy of your text, and I make the same request for the other panelists. Please provide those texts to the committee. The floor is now going to be given to our second briefer, Mrs. Karame Kwemerle, Assistant Professor at Harvard Medical School, Cambridge, a clinical pediatric neurologist who specializes in traumatic brain injury and epilepsy. She is the co-founder of Doctors Against Genocide, an organization driven by global concern over injustices, wars, racism, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, with a focus on Palestine. Mrs. Kwemerle, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished delegates, members of the United Nations, fellow advocates for justice and peace. Thank you so much for having me here. The Nakba is a word that lived with us Palestinians since we were born. It is the catastrophe of the Palestinian people. It was not a natural catastrophe, and it's not a merely historic event. It is a word that does not do justice to the ongoing complete denial of human rights and self-determination for us Palestinians. It is the genocide that was allowed to fester like a disease without prevention or treatment. Nakba at times was given the description of ethnic cleansing, which we all know is a euphemism for genocide. This genocide was a culmination of settler colonial legacy in our homeland. It is a disease that had many symptoms and continues to. Mass killing, mass expulsion, forced eviction, unlawful settlements, land confiscations, pogroms, executions, detentions, restrictions of movements, checkpoints, relentless assaults on civilian population, especially in Gaza. It is no accident that Gaza is the single largest Palestinian city in the world, and it is the city that has been attacked most brutally and most regularly. And now the goal of the perpetrators is to send it to dystopic oblivion. I am a clinician, and as clinicians, we diagnose, and we look for signs and symptoms, and we look for prevention. The failure to formally recognize the Nakba as a genocide, despite meeting all the criteria of clear intent, organization, and preparation for genocide, including arming militias with the explicit purpose of carrying out atrocities as documented in declassified Israeli archives, has allowed the perpetrators to commit genocidal acts with impunity. The Nakba brutal reality of more than 15,000 Palestinians killed, mass expulsions, rape, and massacres qualifies as a Category 7 on the TMK genocide scale. This failure to acknowledge and the international community complicity in legitimizing these crimes empowered the perpetrators to continue heinous acts unchecked, rather than facing accountability for the gravest of crimes. In the contrary, the international community rewarded the perpetrators by recognizing their state and continued to offer multiple failed attempts at peace, despite them not abiding by UNGAR 181194, that they agreed to as preconditions for such recognition. In the duty to prevent and protect against genocide, the reclassification of the Nakba as genocide stands as a critical step in fortifying the legal case of the South Africa case against Israel at the International Court of Justice, and ensuring that the perpetrators of the Nakba are finally held to account for their crimes. With the urgent need for justice and accountability, immediate and decisive action must be taken to rectify the historical injustices of the Nakba and bring to an end to the cycle of genocidal violence in the region. We demand the establishment of an independent legal investigative body sanctioned by the United Nations to thoroughly reassess and examine Nakba as genocide without reservations. I am one of many Palestinians before me who stood here in different spaces at the United Nations demanding our inalienable rights. Our message: we all know our rights and we will not tire of demanding them or pursuing them. Doctors Against Genocide is the brainchild of the Palestinian sons and daughters of the Nakba survivors. Those born after the Nakba are committed to justice and peace for all. As a pediatrician and as a geriatric doctor, Dr. Jbour and myself became deeply aware of the potential for perpetual genocide against our people. We participated in a peace group in 2021 with Palestinians, Israelis, and internationals aiming for a peaceful resolution in Palestine. The discussions revealed a stark denial of Palestinian rights as a condition for peace from the Israeli side. Proposals like a two-state solution faced opposition, with Israeli concerns about security and their view of any and all Palestinians as security threats or demographic threats. They demanded re-education of the Palestinians and constant reassurance of permanent security from us, while our people are the ones violated, violently abused, and marginalized. Our severe lack of security was a non-issue. Some stated that the illegal settlements were needed for their Israeli security. In our efforts to raise awareness about genocide risks in the West Bank, we planned a workshop on genocide prevention for October 2023. The importance of our work was minimized, and the workshop was barely mentioned during a dinner at a conference, which was later canceled due to resistance to including Palestinian perspective. Naming our organization Doctors Against Genocide faced skepticism, especially given our Palestinian identity. Critics doubted the success of the organization, but we persisted, driven by the need to educate and unify the medical community against human rights abuses. Doctors Against Genocide, due to the persistence of its founders, was ultimately launched successfully, receiving strong support from medical professionals globally, and adopting never again for everyone as our guiding principle, and advocating for universal values across all communities. We are now using our skills as medical community in accordance with our moral obligation. We are guided by the principle of our vocation in holding life and health sacred for all humans, regardless of origin, ethnicity, race, gender, religion, politics, or sexual orientation. Our mission goes beyond the mere treatment of physical wounds as a medical community. It involves addressing deep systematic injustices that prevent healing and prevent peace. We advocate for cessation of hostilities. We advocate for lifting of blockades that suffocate Gaza, the establishment of a fair and just peace that acknowledges the rights and dignities of all Palestinians. We know health is determined by factors that transcend a drug or a vaccine. Health is rooted in justice, equity, access, food and water security, education, and general well-being. In Palestine, there is everything but and any and all of the above. As proud Palestinians, we leverage our collective power to define our own narrative, describe our own pain, and heal our own wounds. No nation, no people, no community should ever endure what we have faced before Nakba until now. It is our life mission to ensure that history will not judge us for our failures, but commends us for our resolve in correcting them. We see the repercussions of our inactions in the eyes of every wounded child with no surviving family in Gaza. We know that prevention is far superior to treatment. These principles should not only apply to medicine, but should apply to human rights violations. While there is no universally accepted medical definition of genocide, let us consider it as a systematic and intentional campaign of violence, destruction, and stark injustice. It involves the deliberate infliction of harm that leads to severe, widespread suffering and long-term health consequences, least of which is death. Ethically, the only way forward for us as a medical community and as an international community is to advocate for prevention, intervention, and mitigation of such atrocities. Stopping the genocide in Gaza requires more than acknowledgement. It needs immediate and effective action. The strategies are clear. We have to recognize and prevent. We have to apply pressure, coupled with legal accountability for the perpetrators. We have to consider deployment of peacekeeping forces when necessary, as all else has failed in Gaza. Comprehensive support for survivors to foster healing and resilience is a must. In the medical community, we are ready to support all these efforts. We raise awareness, we provide direct medical aid, we advocate for policy changes, we support organizations striving for justice. Some of our own are now trapped in Rafah, treating patients while sleeping on the floors and unable to return to their duties and obligations in their home countries. But their commitment is only strengthened by the suffering of the children in Gaza. We need a safe passage for them to leave and for the next teams to take their place. Let's ensure that our legacy as doctors, Palestinians, and a global community is defined not by the atrocities we failed to stop, but by the lives we chose to save and the peace we helped to forge. Above all, we are inspired by our colleagues in Gaza. In the words of Dr. Hammam El-Loh, do you think I went to medical school for 14 years to think about my life and not about my patients? And if I go, who treats my patients? We are not animals. We have the right to receive proper health care. So we can't just leave. He said that in response to a question about him evacuating the hospital that he was in to a safer area. He was killed a few weeks after he said these words in an interview. If I die, you must live, said Rafat al-Aruri, who was also killed by Israeli bombardment. We need an immediate ceasefire to save the rest of Gaza, and we need to free Palestine. Thank you very much.
Professor Kwemerle, we thank you for this very insightful analysis through the lens of your very specific medical expertise of the harsh reality lived by the Palestinian people, harsh reality of the trauma lived by these people, and also for the strong lessons and messages you have so clearly and convincingly expressed. Thank you. We are now going to listen to Mrs. Phyllis Bennis. Mrs. Bennis is a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., and there she directs the New Internationalism Project, and she's also the international advisor to the Jewish Voice for Peace. A writer, a political commentator, and a leading advocate for Palestinian rights, she focuses mainly on issues related to the Middle East and the United Nations. Mrs. Bennis, I have the pleasure to give you the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for participating in this. I'd like to thank particularly the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People and the Division for Palestinian Rights for organizing this very important commemoration of the Nakba. Even commemoration is perhaps not the right word because it implies something of the past, not something that continues. You know, we are meeting today at a very strange moment of history, and we are commemorating, if you will, a very contradictory reality. 1948 saw the birth of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the birth of the Convention Against Genocide. It could have set the stage for an era of human rights in the post-World War II era. But 1948 was also the year that gave rise to apartheid in South Africa and to the Nakba in Palestine. And instead of an era of human rights, we saw a continuation of the era of settler colonialism, knowing that settler colonialism, even though it was under attack, it was being ended in so much of the world through brave struggles across Africa, the Middle East, Asia, Latin America. In this case, settler colonialism was not over, and the Nakba of 1948 transformed Palestine. It transformed Palestinian history, and it consolidated one of the last colonial projects in the era of decolonization. Both South African apartheid and the Nakba in Palestine were enabled by Western colonial and imperial interests. South Africa and Namibia are now free, playing an extraordinary role in the world. And now the United States, unlike the earliest stages of the Nakba, but now for sure, the US is the main enabler of the current version of the Nakba, which is underway, particularly what we see in the genocide in Gaza, which is funded and armed by the United States, arming genocide through its provision of military aid, transfer of weapons, and the provision of absolute impunity to the Israeli state for its violations of international law, international humanitarian law, and the human rights of the population. We have already seen in this escalation of the Nakba, we have seen 3 times as many people killed in Gaza, in a very small piece of historic Palestine, than were killed during the original Nakba in 1948. 36,000 people known to be killed, tens of thousands, probably more, buried under the rubble. 15,000 were killed in the period of the Nakba in 1948. 500 villages were destroyed in the Nakba in 1948. In Gaza, we have already seen the destruction of 6 major cities, 8 major refugee camps, and virtually the entire infrastructure of the Gaza Strip, all destroyed. The expulsion and dispossession of 750,000 Palestinians in 1948 in the Nakba has now led to the expulsion and dispossession, in many cases more than once, of 1.3 to 1.5 million of Gaza's 2.3 million people already. And that is underway over and over again on a daily basis. What we see shared in the period from 1948 until 2023 and now 2024 is that none of this was accidental. None of this was simply the unfortunate result of a military battle, because we see the deliberate nature of these attacks. We see the plan, because it's the same plan. The plan for ethnic cleansing, for seizing the land, for settling new colonies on what had been Palestinian land. Before October 7th of 2023, the year 2023, those first 8 months, had already been the bloodiest months across the occupied Palestinian territory since 1948. In the West Bank, there was an escalation of massive number of arrests, of pogroms carried out by settlers in Palestinian villages against those villages, military attacks by Israeli soldiers, the death of more Palestinians than any year before. And in Gaza, that year, a new study was released indicating that in the 16 years of the siege of Gaza, 20% of Gaza's children were already stunted by the age of 2 before October 7, before October 8th and the period since then. that has led to an absolute denial of food, of water, of medicine, of shelter. This was under the easy version of a siege, the easy blockade that lasted for 16, now 17 years. And that was the effect on the children of Gaza already. In that entire period, from 1948 till 2023-24, we have seen absolute impunity for the Israeli state. Since 1967, with the creation of the so-called special relationship between my government, the government of the United States, and the State of Israel, we have seen the absolute impunity guaranteed directly by the United States, including here in the United Nations, where the U.S. consistently uses its veto in the Security Council to undermine efforts at creating a ceasefire, whether it was in 2006 in Israel's war against Lebanon, in 2008 and 2009 in Operation Cast Lead against Gaza, again in Gaza in 2012, again in 2014, in the 55-day assault on Gaza of that year, in 2018, in 2021, and now again, the United States has said we don't need a ceasefire yet. What do they mean? Not enough people have been killed yet? Not enough children have been killed yet? We don't need a ceasefire yet? And in the General Assembly, Excellencies, where there is no veto, let us be very clear that the United States has been extraordinarily successful at using bribes and threats and punishments against those countries that had the temerity to stand up against U.S. domination of this very institution. That's not a new reality. That's something that goes back to the origins of the United Nations, I'm sorry to say. There's not time today to go through that history, but it is a long-standing reality. In the current period, in this escalation that we have seen of the Nakba process that has been underway, the specific intent required by the Convention Against Genocide was made very clear by Israeli officials, military officials, political officials, members of the Knesset, members of the government, the president, the prime minister, the defense minister, other ministers, over and over again, bragging, not afraid, not ashamed, that they were intending to wipe Gaza off the face of the earth, to bring it back to the Stone Age, that they were dealing with animals and not people. They weren't worried about these statements because they knew they had the protection of the United States, that they would never be held accountable. They would not be held accountable in the International Criminal Court. They would not be held accountable by the Security Council. They would not be held accountable by the United Nations itself. And they would not be held accountable in the International Court of Justice. It took the initiative of South Africa, now the Rainbow Nation, the post-apartheid nation, taking that initiative to say to the world that the institutions largely created in the interest of the colonial countries in the post-World War II moment could now themselves be claimed by the once colonized countries. It was a huge victory, even before their ruling, their almost unanimous ruling, that the actions of Israel are possibly genocidal. Those actions were first welcomed by the President of the United States, by President Biden, with a bear hug and with more weapons. The $3.8 billion worth of weapons that the U.S. sends to Israel every year, this year has skyrocketed up to $17 billion worth of weapons. The U.S. is now more complicit in this genocide than it ever has been before, not only because of the weapons that it is providing to carry out the genocide, but because of the impunity, and then the additional weapons on top of that. But this time there are consequences that we are seeing. Israeli cruelty seen across the world, on our screens, on our phones, on our computers, on our tablets, on our televisions, heard on our radios, across the world, has not fallen on deaf ears. There is a movement that has risen across the world to say no, to say we demand a genocide that will last, a permanent genocide. And in that context, across the United States, public opinion has dramatically shifted in a way I never thought I would experience. I've worked on this issue, well, let's just say for a longer time than I care to admit. And I thought I would never see a position in which a U.S. elected official would be threatened with losing their next election because they were seen as being too supportive of Israel. That might happen to President Biden. That's not my choice. That's not something I applaud, because it's resulting from the U.S. complicity in the death of thousands of Palestinians, thousands of children. But what we are seeing is this incredible shift in public opinion, so that 80% of President Biden's own party want an immediate ceasefire, right? We're not surprised to see that this movement that is not new. There has been a movement for Palestinian rights in the United States for decades. If we look back 20, 25 years, that movement has made incredible progress at changing public opinion, at changing media coverage. But it's not anywhere near where it needed to be to actually result in policy shifts. Shifting the public opinion, shifting the media coverage is only step one. It's much more difficult to change the actual policy. But what we've seen here, we saw earlier in 2023, 44% of Democrats, 44%, said that Israel was like an apartheid state. 2 years before that, in 2021, in a poll of American Jewish voters, 25% of Jewish voters in this country said Israel is an apartheid state, and 38% of young Jews, not my generation, the young Jews, said that Israel is an apartheid state. So what we're looking at now is a movement that has grown from that beginning to something extraordinary that we've never seen, with occupations of the halls of Congress, Jewish Voice for Peace, the organization I'm privileged to work with, occupying Grand Central Station, the Statue of Liberty, the resignation of more and more administration officials who say, I cannot work for administration even when I believe in what it is doing on so many domestic issues, but I cannot be part of it when it is carrying out this policy towards Gaza. Rabbis for ceasefire came here to the United Nations. They prayed in the Security Council chambers. They met with the SG on the 38th floor to say, we are here to support the United Nations efforts at creating a ceasefire, and we're here to tell you that we do not stand with our government's refusal to allow the United Nations to do its job. That kind of work has never been seen before. The vote of uncommitted across this country, which is now enough to send delegates to the Democratic Party convention this summer to say, we are going to vote against the support for genocide. We don't know what we're going to do, but we are saying we cannot now vote for someone we see as supporting genocide. This has never happened before. And then on the campuses across this country. 175 campuses at the last count, it's probably more because it's rising day by day, where the tents are going up. You know, the tents were first a symbol of the genocide, the Nakba of 1948. And now the tents have become the symbol of the resistance of students around the world, not only in the United States, across Canada, in Germany, in South Africa, across the world. Students are building encampments on their campuses to be part of a global opposition, to say we need a ceasefire now. And it's not only young Jews, obviously. This is the justice generation. This is the generation in my country that came of age politically in the summer of 2020 with the protests against the police killing of George Floyd, and came to see Palestinian rights as an issue of being against racism, seeing the colonization of Palestinian land as a racist occupation. And that justice generation has been pretty active lately. And they are changing the political character of what political leaders across this country have to take into account. We have been hearing from the administration a new kind of rhetoric. They are hearing these demands, there's no question. They are hearing it. They are changing their rhetoric. At the beginning, it was only about, all we would hear is Israel has the right to self-defense. Israel has the right to protect itself, as if that included the right to impose genocide on an entire population. But now we're hearing that President Biden was brokenhearted when he heard about the World Central Kitchen humanitarian workers being killed, 7 of them. That same day, his administration authorized the sending of 1,000 or more new bombs, including the 2,000-pound bombs, one of which can decimate the structures and the people of an entire city block. So we're hearing a shift in the language. We're not yet hearing the necessary shift in the policy. 3 days ago, we heard about a new shipment of tank ammunition and mortar rounds. This is not the ceasefire that we are demanding yet. The change in the rhetoric at the White House has not been translated into accepting the need for a ceasefire. You know, it took our movement more than 20 years to normalize the understanding that apartheid was the right term for describing Israeli actions in carrying out its occupations throughout the occupied Palestinian territory. It has taken less than 3 months to normalize the term genocide to describe what Israel is doing across Gaza. And because the Israeli actions and its intentions are so clear, that movement is now growing. We still have a huge amount of work to do. We need to unite our movement with the United Nations as a partner. And we know that there is a huge example of how to do that in the years of the 1970s and 1980s in the struggle against South African apartheid, where the United Nations played a huge role in helping to build the global movement against apartheid. And in those years, it was mainly in the General Assembly, because like now, the Security Council had a veto, and the US, often Great Britain as well, over and over and over again would veto any resolution calling for sanctions against the apartheid regime in Pretoria. But somehow those resolutions kept getting passed in the General Assembly, urging member states to impose an arms embargo, to impose a trade embargo, to stop allowing the apartheid government in South Africa from having access to the global banking system. And over again, we would hear in the United States, oh, don't worry, it's not binding in international law. But somehow, country after country, faced with protest after protest in their own countries, using the statements and the resolutions of the General Assembly as evidence, came to their governments and said, this is your obligation. And we are demanding, we the people of your country, are demanding that you carry it out, whether or not it's legally binding according to the UN Charter. And what do you know? One day in the 1980s, enough countries had done that, enough allies of the United States had done that the United States itself finally gave in, and the Congress passed a resolution calling for sanctions against apartheid South Africa. And yes, then President Reagan vetoed the resolution, but that veto was overturned by the Congress. That's what we need to do. South Africa showed us the way with its recent initiative in the International Court of Justice, challenging the US guarantee of impunity for Israel. The ICJ ruling is now a tool of global civil society to hold up to our governments, demanding that your governments, excellencies, the governments that all of you represent, who now have this obligation, most of your governments are signatories, are state parties of the Genocide Convention. And unlike most conventions, the Genocide Convention puts obligations on every state party, not only on the country being accused of violating the terms, but on every country that is a state's party to the Genocide Convention. There is the obligation to work to prevent genocide, and if a genocide occurs, to do everything in your power to stop it. You have the model in the resolutions that were passed and how they were implemented during the years of struggle against South African apartheid. It's your opportunity to be on the right side of history. The committee can take the lead with Palestinian and global civil society, to bring the UN as a whole back to doing what the Charter says it was created to do, to stop the scourge of war. And doesn't that have to also mean to stop the scourge of genocide? Even when that genocide is being enabled by the most powerful member state of this organization? We have a lot of work to do. We start with the demand for an immediate and lasting ceasefire, and we move on from there. We have a lot of work to do. Thank you.
Mrs. Benis, we are once again honored to have you with us. I would like to seize this opportunity to really thank you for your principled stances on the question of Palestine. We appreciate the perspective and the very passionate views you have shared on the question of Palestine as perceived by large sections here in the US, by the administration and by society at large. And I paid attention to what you said about the justice generation. And we thank you for your encouragements, also for your recommendations. And I'm sure what you have said has not fallen in deaf ear. So thank you so very much for also being a very constructive and long-standing partner of the committee. We have listened to all our distinguished panelists, whom I thank for their pertinent statements. I would like to request those who are going to take the floor, if they have a written statement, to send it to the e-statement. Yeah, to send the e-statement to the DGACM. I think you know how to proceed with that. You are used to it. So I'm going to open the floor to those member states who want to take the floor. And for the time being on my list, for member states, I have Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Morocco, Jordan, Libya, and then I have an NGO called IDLO, but I will start with Malaysia. Malaysia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I would like to, I'm just taking the mic to say thank you to the panelists for sharing their thoughts and their insights on the issue. There are some points there for us to ponder, and I'd like to thank the organizer for organizing today's event. Thank you very much.
No, they're not. But to see.
That's up to you. I think it would be.
Do you want me to Malaysia, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, but I've already made my remarks. Thank you. Thanks.
Sorry for not paying attention. I will get the gist of what you have said with my secretariat. I was conferring with Minister Mansour. Minister Mansour was supposed to make concluding remarks, but he has now an engagement. And I would like to give him the floor so far to comment on what he has just heard, and then we'll be able to proceed. And after, I give the floor to Sri Lanka. Minister Mansour, do you want to say something?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to say again, how grateful we are for organizing this event, to the committee, to you, Mr. Chairman, to the division, and to all, to our distinguished panelists who gave us very inspiring statements and assessments about the global picture, which is creating a new condition that did not exist in the history of the Palestine question in the United States, for example, and at the global level.
by the President of the United States, by President Biden, with a bear hug and with more weapons. The $3.8 billion worth of weapons that the U.S. sends to Israel every year, this year has skyrocketed up to $17 billion worth of weapons. The U.S. is now more complicit in this genocide than it ever has been before, not only because of the weapons that it is providing to carry out the genocide, but because of the impunity, and then the additional weapons on top of that. But this time there are consequences that we are seeing. Israeli cruelty seen across the world, on our screens, on our phones, on our computers, on our tablets, on our televisions, heard on our radios, across the world, has not...
Ambassador Niang, and to the committee also for organizing this commemoration of the Nakba. But I also truly want to thank the speakers for sharing their insights, their wisdom, and their experiences with us this morning. And we commend the courage of their convictions. It is with the heaviest heart that South Africa has had to mark Nakba Day this year by having to return to the ICJ yesterday to plea for the court to stop the genocide which is knocking Gaza off the map and has shocked the conscience of humanity. Since the ICJ first ordered Israel to implement measures to prevent genocidal acts in February, in January and in March, Israel has willfully continued its genocide apace and has just reached a new horrific stage. Instead of complying with this court's decisions of January, February, and March, Israel has defied the court by trapping, besieging, and bombarding an overcrowded Rafah, exacerbating the security and the safety of 1.5 million highly vulnerable Palestinians. It has become increasingly clear that Israel's action in Rafah are part of the endgame in which Gaza is utterly destroyed. And we've heard from our panelists this morning about this plan. The fact that Israel pushed more than 1 million Palestinians into Rafah under the pretense of ensuring their safety, and then carried out a full-scale bombardment of the province, all while sealing it off from aid and exposing it to famine, is evidence of its genocidal intent. The evacuation zones that Israel has ordered to the people to go to are basically the extermination zones. Rafah is the last stage of the total annihilation of Palestinian life. Without Rafah, the possibility to rebuild and reconstruct Palestinian life will be lost forever. South Africa is calling for an immediate ceasefire, and we did such yesterday at the ICJ. We also appreciate member states that are joining the case at the ICJ for the merit stage, and will appreciate and welcome more of member states to join us. And we thank you all for your support, for your words of encouragement, and we've heard it also for the panel members this morning, and it is most deeply appreciated by the state of South Africa. I thank you.
Thank you very much, my dear sister Mathu. I would like to seize this opportunity to really thank South Africa and say how much you have made us proud in taking that very significant initiative to bring the question of Palestine before the ICJ. I think your courageous and principled action underscores South Africa's unwavering commitment to justice. So we are looking forward to positive developments following your very important initiative. Now I give the floor to the last speaker. Okay, you are no longer speaking. Thank you very much. Okay, now let's move to any other member of the public who I can see one. Maybe you can speak right away. I can see your light. Okay, thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Chair. I'm David Wildman with Global Ministries of the United Methodist Church, and I'm also co-chair of the NGO Working Group on Israel-Palestine, and I want to thank all the panelists today. Given the urgency that everyone has recognized in terms of genocide right now, and this continuing for not 7 months, but over 76 years, I'd like to ask the committee and also the panelists for your comments on 3 things. The urgent need for an arms embargo. The Human Rights Council adopted a resolution at the end of April calling for an immediate end, all member states to immediately end all sales and transfers and purchases of arms relating to Israel. And so I'd like some comments on that. The second is that banking sanctions were something that was very powerful, being used in the anti-apartheid struggle, which the UN played a significant role in relation to South Africa. And our colleagues from South Africa just have been taking the lead here. What steps can be taken by the committee and the UN to call for banking sanctions? And the third is that given the lack of compliance that we've seen just recently in the International Court of Justice, I'm wondering what the committee can do in adopting a resolution here at the General Assembly mandating that member states report on their steps to enforce compliance of the ICJ rulings, given the urgency of preventing genocide. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone who want to take the floor? Okay, I can see you. Please press the button and then you can speak right away.
Yeah, with the help of the Almighty, I pray to the Almighty to bestow upon me His truth, His wisdom, that I may convey His message and so sanctify His name. We are here a delegation of rabbis, some who are originally from Palestine many generations, and I am from survivors from the Holocaust from Europe, from Poland and Hungary. Basically, we are coming here because we are Jews, and as Jews, we are suffering with the people of Gaza, with the people of Palestine. It's an injustice that 76 years ago, the United Nations, that was created to bring peace to the world, ratified a creation of a state that was called the State of Israel, a Jewish state, they refer to it, meaning that it's symbolic and that it represents Judaism as the religion of Judaism, which that's all a Jewish state could possibly mean. And therefore, they are automatically subjugating the other inhabitants of the land, the Muslims and the Christians, that will be second-class citizens. The Jewish community that was living there for hundreds of years was not accepting of this concept at all, because Judaism is simply a religion of 3,000 years to be subservient to God, to serve God. And we're even ironically forbidden since the destruction of the temple 2,000 years ago to create a Jewish sovereignty, even 1 centimeter or inch of Jewish sovereignty around the world. And that was respected by the Jews who practiced the religion and gave their lives for the religion for these 2,000 years of our exile. Certainly not by occupying another people or taking the land of another people. Certainly not of a people that was so friendly to the Jews, embraced us through our hundreds of years when there was the existence of Islam and when we were being oppressed in Europe and tried to forcibly be converted into Christianity. Was the Muslim and Arab countries that embraced us, and we flourished amongst them without any human rights groups or United Nations to protect us. So it's simply nothing to do with a religious conflict. Jews were always able to live amongst Arabs and Muslims, and Judaism is nothing to do with a creation of a nationalist home. Simply, it was a group of nationalists 100-odd years ago who used the facade of my religion, Judaism, the religion that my grandparents died in Auschwitz for, and they're using this religion as a stick, as to stifle, to intimidate the people who are opposing the stealing of the homes of the people of Palestine. And when anybody dares to speak up, they accuse them of being anti-Semitic. That's totally not true. It's really revolting and, to hear that people who are so friendly to the Jews, we lived together for hundreds and hundreds of years in peace and harmony, and to accuse them, these people who embraced us and gave us a new life for hundreds of years, to accuse these people of being haters of Jews because of our religion, that is unacceptable, and it's ungodly, it's not Jewish. Basically, this concept, when they, just as South Africa, as an apartheid state, even though it was accepted in this distinguished United Nations that was created to bring peace to the world, made a big mistake, because everybody today will admit that although it was tens of years that South Africa as an apartheid state was accepted, that it was a flawed and terrible mistake of the world. And today nobody will accept such a thing. And the ones who opposed them were called terrorists, as Nelson Mandela, for 27 years in prison, was called a terrorist. It's the same thing as with Israel. Yes, the United Nations did accept it, they did ratify the state, but that, even though it's a distinguished body, the United Nations, that does not legitimize when a group of people come along and take the land away from another people, and especially when they're doing it in the name of a religion that's 3,000 years that expressly states we are forbidden to have a land, we are forbidden to steal, and we're to show gratitude to good unto us. Therefore, we as Jews around the world who are true to our religion will never accept this transformation of my religion into this nationalism. We will never accept the oppression of the people of Palestine. We cry and hurt with the people of Gaza. Every single one who are dying and suffering in Gaza is blood on our hearts. We feel and hurt with them, especially us who've gone through Hitler and the Nazis. We feel, we hurt, and we want the world to know that one day, as the Almighty writes in His Torah, that it says, why are you rebelling against me? It will not be successful. This occupation, just as apartheid ended, this will totally end. With God help, a speedy and peaceful total removal of the occupation so that there could be a free Palestine. We can live in freedom. We can live together and serve God together in freedom. This is truth. This is Judaism. And this, inshallah, we hope to see soon in our days, a free Palestine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir, for your positive message. I don't know whether there is anyone else wanting to take the floor.
They're changing the same place. They're all sitting there.
Okay, there's someone?
Yes.
Okay, please press the button and then you can speak. Thank you.
What number? 1? Can you hear me? Whoop, there we go. Okay. Thank you so much for allowing the community to speak as well, and for hosting this, and for allowing us to be here. I am Lauren Cycli. I am Zaina Azam's niece. My family lived in Palestine for 300 years. My grandparents left in 48 with my father, who was 2. And I have been trying to be very, very active as I can, with small businesses to take care of as well, and children to raise. And what I wanted to put out there for the panelists is the following. My entire feed on social media and everything that I take in every day is about Gaza and activism. And I saw yesterday posts about what Israel is planning for the future of Gaza and for the land. And I would like to, I think we need as activists to start putting out in the world the discourse of who is going to lead Palestine, who are the Palestinians that will lead Palestine, after this ceasefire. It will end, the violence will end, and I think we need to start putting out there what the future looks like for Palestinians, and that, I think, has to come from the diaspora, rather than coming from Israel or its complicit United States. If you all have ideas of what that's going to look like or who's handling that already, I think the world should know. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. I think, okay, we have another speaker. Please go ahead.
Do you hear me? Do you hear me? Assalamu alaikum. My name is Dr. Nidal Jabour. I'm a Palestinian doctor. I'm here with my friend Dr. Karama Hawash. She's a co-founder. We are both co-founders of Doctors Against Genocide. So thank you for inviting us and giving us the opportunity. My question starts with the fact that I think the international community and the international system have failed the Palestinian people for the last 100 years. It failed to recognize the Nakba as such, which was a crime of genocide. The reason we are going through a genocide now, the Palestinian people, the reason we have been going through a genocide for the last 100 years is because the international community never addressed the original sin, especially after the declassification of the Israeli archives. We have ample evidence for a full intent of genocide from all the Zionist leaders and the Israeli government officials, from Ben-Gurion and all of them. We have ample evidence that there was sufficient organization and preparation for the genocide at least 10 years before 48. The Nakba happened in 48, which is the same month that the United Nations recognized genocide as an international crime. But the world chose to turn a blind eye and let it go because of the guilt regarding the Holocaust. And the Palestinians have to pay the price for all of this. The only reason we are going through a genocide now is because the first genocide has never been addressed. If you go and study the Nakba, and many scholars did study the Nakba and decided that it was a genocide, and actually it is category 7 genocide, which is the second highest on the scale of genocide. And there is enough research and study to prove that. What's going on in Gaza now is category 8. And instead of holding the perpetrators accountable for their crime, for their genocide, the international community recognized Israel as a state, rewarded them with multiple failed attempts at peace. We know that genocide perpetrators never accept peace. You cannot make peace with genocide perpetrators because they are not in this for peace. They are in this for complete annihilation of the native people. My question is, what does it take for the United Nations international community now to create a special body and an independent investigation team to restudy the Nakba, reclassify the Nakba as an act of genocide, to put things where they're supposed to be, to hold the perpetrators accountable, and to strengthen the case of the genocide at the ICJ now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Next speaker.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much to the committee, especially also to the Division for Palestinian Rights. My name is Joseph Cornelius Donnelly. I have served here at the UN as an ECOSOC representative for the last 25 years. The first time I spoke in this building was 35 years ago during a session of the CSW on refugee women and children. And during that session, there was incredible, beautiful conversation about needs and hopes. But the word Palestine and the Palestinian children and refugees and women was never mentioned. And my voice was suppressed until one woman from India said, "May we recognize the man whose hand has been up for an hour?" And that's when I began to get the courage to say, speak up, and sometimes maybe be respectful, but shout out loud and say what we know to be the truth. So I'm here to say today, having spoken to Jerusalem, Haifa, and Gaza this morning before coming here, there are so many words we've heard, especially during these 7 months. The word we don't hear and we need to say to the world and underscore, it's evil, it's obscene, and it's immoral. And we need to bring a vocabulary of peace and justice that confronts people's complacency and comfort and speak like that boy who says to his mother, write my name on your legs. Hear it, as our poet here today said to us so memorably. Thank you very much for this extremely moving panel today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for your intervention. I think that was the last speaker from the general public. And I think we are now going to conclude very soon. Questions have been raised. Some questions have been leveled to the committee. On that, I would like just to comment that the committee has been monitoring and following all developments related to the treatment on the question of Palestine here at the UN and elsewhere. And the committee will, in due time, signal or express precise the next steps related to the question of Palestine. And since the exercise of this interaction is to have our panelists share their views and perspective, I just want to leave the limelight with them. And I will also invite them to if they want to make comments on the questions which have been raised, particularly by Mr. David Wildman, our long-standing friend, they can do so. They can also respond to other questions. So right now I'll invite our 4 panelists to comment on the statements which have been made, on the questions which have been raised, and then at the same time to make their final statements, their final concluding remarks, and then after that I will close the meeting. So I will start with Mrs. Zaina Azam. I don't know whether you want to make some comments before I give the floor to the panelists.
I can make just a few comments, yeah. Thank you for all your comments and questions. As a poet and as someone who's so involved in culture, Palestinian culture, and also I think the answer to what do we do is to keep Palestine at the top of the agenda, to give opportunities for Palestinian voices on every level, in education and diplomacy, etc. And to, especially Palestinian arts. We're always so looking at Palestine as this, country of conflict, but there's just so much more. It has a rich history, it has a rich culture and heritage, and so, we need to uplift the tatriz, the embroidery. We need to uplift the poetry and the dance and the music, and the architecture and so much more. So that would be my plea also, is to keep Palestine at the top of the agenda and look at Palestinian humanity and culture as important in doing so.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Azam, for your very inspiring words and for the beautiful poems you read earlier. Now I'm going to turn to the 3 panelists, starting by Professor Adi Msais and then Professor Karame Kwemerle and Mrs. Phyllis Benis. So please respond to what you have heard, and also, if you need, to the questions which have been raised. Professor Msais.
Thank you very much for the questions and the opportunity to sort of wrap up. I've told my students and a number of audiences that I've had the pleasure or not to speak to over the past few months that we are now at an inflection point in international relations, in the history, certainly modern history, and certainly the history of the United Nations. An inflection point that pits effectively the small number of Western states that carry on with the torch of neo-imperialism and so on, and we know who they are, against everybody else, the G77, the Global South, the former colonized world. We see this inflection point pointing up problems in the United Nations system and in how we govern ourselves as humanity on the planet. And we are thankful, again, to those states from the Global South, South Africa, in particular Nicaragua, and others, who are standing firm and fast on the promise of this organization, as told to us by its founders. We were told in 1945 that the United Nations Charter heralded a new world order, a liberal order, universal applications of human rights, regardless of the station or position of the individuals in question, the states in question, and so on. And there is a clear tension now before us between those claims on the one hand and how they operate, in fact, on the ground on the other. Some rights, some states, some peoples remain more equal than others. And so the challenge is before each and every one of us, member states, free women, men, people of the world, of conscience, to do something about it. So in answer to the first question of Mr. Wildman, what to do, he'd mentioned arms embargoes and banking sanctions and so on. As an international lawyer, I would just like to paint a broader picture. All states have obligations under various bodies of international law to universally apply those bodies. Let's just take the Genocide Convention, for example. There is a duty to prevent genocide, as was mentioned by Phyllis earlier, of all states parties to the Genocide Convention. And that duty has been triggered. All parties to the Genocide Convention have been put on notice of a real and substantial risk of genocide taking place in Gaza, at least since the 26th of January, 2024, the first provisional measures order issued by the principal judicial organ of the United Nations. Now the question is, whatever are those states going to do, states parties to the Genocide Convention, to prevent? And there are a whole host of things that can and indeed must be done to prevent. I'll get to those in a moment. Another body of law, the law of armed conflict. Anybody who deals with the question of Palestine will know that the Fourth Geneva Convention relative to the protection of civilian persons in time of war, which continues to apply and has never stopped applying in the occupied Palestinian territory since June 1967, has a common Article 1 in it that imposes a duty on all high contracting parties not only to respect the terms of the convention, but to, quote, ensure their respect. That means when other states are violating the convention, they have an independent obligation to ensure that those states abide by their obligations under the convention. Of course, the convention covers a great deal of what is happening in the Gaza Strip and in the occupied Palestinian territory, including prohibiting the willful killing, settlement of an occupied territory, deportation of that territory, and so on, of its population and so on. So there's a great deal of legal bases on which states can act. What can they do? I would take a broad view. Economic, cultural, civil, political, and social. Any international lawyer in here knows that those are the 5 heads of human rights in the system. And those are 5 actions, 5 heads of action that can be pursued by member states to ensure in their bilateral relations and in their multilateral relations that touch on Israel, but in their bilateral relations in particular with Israel, that the message is made clear. We will not stand for these actions because they violate not only the international legality and the legal system, whether under the Genocide Convention or the Fourth Geneva Convention or what have you, the Apartheid Convention and so on, but because they violate basic principles of human morality, basic principles of what makes us human. And there, the people must speak in each of the territories of their countries. But my message to you, dear friends, is to send the message back to your capitals that action is required, not merely as a matter of comity, but as a matter of obligation of member states, parties to the Geneva Conventions, parties to the Genocide Convention, and so on. I shall leave it there. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Imsais, for your very profound and detailed response and indications for the way forward. Professor Koemerle, do you have any comments and your final words also?
Yes.
Thank you.
So we heard the word evil, and I feel that our world and our universe always tries to find good. And I feel that what is happening now is that we have a new paradigm for our generation to correct injustices together globally, and we see that Palestine is energizing many people who have never been activists, including myself. And we are thriving to make this world more just, more peaceful, and to provide more equity for everyone. So the civil society has been engaged because of Palestine, the students, the different professionals who have never done anything, and the movement is growing, and I think it will make the world a much better place for all of us. There has been so many changes that we are proud of as humanity. We have rectified, we sanctioned slavery, we sanctioned bullying, we created gender equality, many positive changes that have happened because of people getting mobilized, more so than just governments. People make their governments do things. And I feel we are seeing a big movement where the people are demanding change and they're demanding a better world, and the governments have to oblige.
Thank you so very much, Mrs. Koemerle, Professor Koemerle. Now I'm going to give the floor to the last speaker, who was also the last panelist, Mrs. Phyllis Bennis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for the questions and comments. A couple of thoughts about some of the earlier questions. The ambassador of Indonesia raised this question of the rights of refugees, too often being forgotten, being ignored. And it does come back to the question of UNRWA, because I just would remind colleagues here, remind you all, that the mandate of UNRWA is the only mandate of any agency in the United Nations that has the mandate to protect the rights of Palestinian refugees. That's the importance of it beyond. It is the most important provider of the basics of life, of water, of food, of medical care, of education, of shelter, and of rights. Those things can't be separated. So in answer to the question of what can we do to support refugee rights, the answer is do not allow the United States decision to pull out its funding to mean that UNRWA cannot survive. Make up the funding, escalate the funding, take the place of those who criminally, in my view, are refusing to pay their due share to the refugees of Palestine. On the questions that my colleague David has raised, just a couple of thoughts. On the question of the arms embargo, which is by far the most important part, you know, this is now part of the definition of a ceasefire. Right now, it's not enough to just call a ceasefire. There has to be action to make it happen, and that means stop sending weapons. My government, as you know, is responsible for at least, I think the last figure was something like 65%. I think it might be higher, but at least 65% of the weapons that Israel is using to kill Palestinians. They have got to stop, and we are working 24/7 to make them stop. But it isn't only the United States. The rest is being carried out by other governments who are also buying from the Israeli military companies surveillance equipment, for example. Many of the countries represented here in this room right now today are buying from Israeli companies stuff, equipment, things that I've never understood and probably never will, designed to watch over their own citizens. Stop doing that. For your own citizens' sake and for the Israeli military economy. It will help the refugees in answer to that. On the question of the need for an arms embargo, there is a history of this, not only in the context of South African apartheid, but going back to the Israeli annexation attempt of the Syrian Golan Heights back in 1981 and 82. The first decision called for by the General Assembly at that time was to impose an arms embargo on Israel in response to that. It hasn't ever been implemented. But there are models for this. This is not something new and different. On the question that, what is your niece's name?
Lauren.
What Lauren just raised about the future, a critical question for Palestinians. For those of us who are not Palestinians, it's not our call. It's not up to us to say who should be running the Gaza Strip, who are the acceptable Palestinians. As Lauren said, it's for the Palestinians in the diaspora and in the refugee camps in the region and those inside 48 and those in the OPT. All of them have that right, which we don't have. So it's not up to us to make that call. Finally, just a couple of closing thoughts. One is that the United Nations has a history of short-term decisions that can make it side on the right side of history, side with civil society, side with social movements. And I speak directly to the history of the run-up to the war in Iraq. In the period in 2002 into 2003, the United Nations Security Council, as many of you will remember, was divided. The United States and Britain were demanding that every country there support a UN endorsement of this coming war. And the uncommitted six, countries that don't necessarily have the capacity to stand up to the United States, to defy United States pressure, stood up because they stood together and because people all over the world in those six countries, they were Angola, Cameroon, Guinea, Mexico, Chile. Is that six? That's six. It was an extraordinary moment for those countries. They were the heroes of the global mobilization against war for standing up directly in the Security Council. And they showed the way for what that can look like. That there was the understanding that the war might happen, but if the UN said no, that maybe it would not. And many of you will remember that on February 15th of 2003, the day the world said no to war, there were protests around the world in more than 800 cities in over 75 countries, in every continent, including Antarctica, where the scientists went out and tramped out a peace sign in the snow and stood in it in their red parkas to have a picture taken from above. It was an extraordinary moment, and on that morning when the whole world was saying no, a very small group of us, led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu and Harry Belafonte, met with then Secretary General Kofi Annan to say that we were there on behalf of the people that were marching in, at that moment we thought, 600 cities all around the world, and to say that we're here on behalf of those people marching to say we claim the United Nations as our own. Those were Bishop Tutu's words. And it seems to me that that's very much the words we need to be keeping in mind today, that the United Nations does not belong to the capitals alone. The United Nations does not belong to the corporations, and the United Nations does certainly not belong to the United States. It belongs to the people of the world. And when the people of the world are saying, we need an immediate ceasefire that will last, that is permanent, it's up to the United Nations to be part of that mobilization to make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Benis. We have now come to the end of this event. Today, the commemoration of another year of the Palestinian Nakba provides an important opportunity for reflection and for mobilization in pursuit of a just solution that will underpin peace and security for Palestinians, Israelis, and the region as a whole. I thank you all for your participation, and your intervention have been really enlightening. I would like to thank once again the great and inspiring poetess, Zain Azam, our two eminent professors, Professor Imsey and Professor Kwemerle, and our great militant, tireless militant for peace and justice, Phyllis Benis. And it goes without saying that support from the international community to Palestinian rights is of crucial importance during these times of intense suffering in Gaza, but also in the other parts of the OPT. Thank you for making the effort to be here. As per usual practice, the chair summary of this conference will be posted on the website of the committee at www.unispal.un.org. And the video recording of this event will also be available on UN Web TV and on the committee's YouTube channel. Let me also remind you that you can also follow the committee on our website at unispal.un.org, on X, formerly Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And we invite you in joining our mailing list to receive the committee newsletter and to stay up to date with the committee's activities. For your information, as part of its efforts to contribute towards a just, comprehensive, and lasting settlement of the question of Palestine, on the 1st of July, the committee will organize, in partnership with the OIC, the annual conference on the question of Jerusalem. This year, the event will be held at the OIC headquarters in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. We look forward to your ongoing engagement and to welcome you in our future events. I thank you all. This meeting is adjourned.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Yes.
One announcement by the Secretariat.
Just quickly, there will be a talk by Professor R.D.
Can't be heard.
No? Yes, there will be a book presentation of his latest book on some of the topics that he mentioned now in the bookshop at the UN in the first basement, and it will start at 1:30. So you're all welcome to join this event. Thank you.